It involves not just 9/11, it also involves the Iraq War, the Clinton family, the Bush family, the so-called octopus and the murder of the reporter Danny Casolaro, the rise of the surveillance state, government-sponsored terrorism, Israel, of course, Jeffrey Epstein, weapon development, straight through to the current events in Gaza today. It's literally all connected. Okay, so far we've talked about the wiring of buildings for controlled demolition. And so far it's a bit of an abstraction because you haven't seen anybody do it. Well, I found some footage where you actually see the process of wiring a building for demolition.
This is a how-to video on how to blow up a mosque in Gaza. Format is internet fluent. The content is very real. Filmed, edited, and posted on Instagram by an Israeli soldier. It's one of dozens reviewed by CNN. For many in 2024, social media is everyday life. Israeli soldiers are no different.
Now, we don't have footage of that particular mosque being exploded, but here's a university in Gaza, and you can see the power of the explosives that they're using, pulverizing. It turned everything to dust. Just to recap, we've covered the reality that buildings 1 and buildings 2 and building 7 of the World Trade Center complex were destroyed by controlled demolition. We've given you an idea of physically how you would do that, what kind of materials you would need. We've shown that the weekend before the controlled demolition, there was highly unusual activity in the World Trade Center complex. They had an unprecedented power down. They had all kinds of people showing up in overalls with boxes and cables who worked all weekend long. So I think we know how the buildings were demolished. We know the mechanics of when it was done. What we don't know is who pulled the trigger. Now, not who ordered it or who planned it, but who pulled the trigger. Now we have to go into circumstantial evidence. There are a lot of twisted people in the military, in the CIA, and the FBI, and the whole federal government. But I don't think, and there are a lot of good people too, who greatly outnumber those people. But I don't think as twisted as some of the people are in our national security apparatus that you could find many Americans that would be willing to wire the Twin Towers and demolish them with people inside. I just don't think you could. And I also don't think that any branch of the military or the government, any known branch of the military of the government, would be willing to be involved in such a thing. The trick is you'd have to have a team that knew this particular kind of technical work, that had worked before, and you're only going to find that in a military. Now, you need a military that does not have compunction about doing something injurious to the United States or to American citizens, and that has a motivation to do that. Now, who would that be? We were told that it was guys in caves with box cutters. What if there was a country that needed to inflame the American people and get them involved in a war that would serve the country that wanted to do the inflaming? So two things: you have to bring in outside people, and two, you have to keep that operation completely silent, cut off, segregated, completely covert. So you couldn't use Americans. So who would you use? Who would you use if you needed people who had an ideological reason to commit an act of violence against the United States, who would be fully committed to this particular mission, who you could count on to keep their mouths shut? I have a suggestion. What about the Israelis? There's three reasons you use Israelis. One, they've got the skills. And to use a sports analogy, they have a deep bench. They've got a lot of people that have building demolition skills at a military level. Two, they can travel into and out of the United States very easily, no problem whatsoever. But the most important reason is you absolutely have people in the Israeli military and the Israeli society who have a strong ideological commitment to the Zionist vision. And as we're seeing today, and this is being recorded in March 2024, the Zionist mission is, we are surrounded by enemies. Therefore, anything we do is justifiable. Now, the big geopolitical problem that Israel has is it's a very small country. And it behaves very aggressively, very belligerently, completely outside of the law. And surprise, surprise, when you act that way for decades at a time, you develop enemies. So they need a big supporter to come in and back them up, provide them with diplomatic support, for instance, in the UN, at the Security Council, provide them with munitions as they continue to carry out a genocide in Gaza. And that, of course, is the United States. So we all know that the blowing up of the World Trade Center was used as the justification for the United States to invade Iraq. Iraq, which had absolutely nothing to do with the World Trade Center demolition. But that's how we ended up in Iraq, because of that and because they had weapons of mass destruction. Therefore, if you could somehow create an event that would drive the United States into attacking Iraq, that would be a good thing. A good thing for who? For the United States? Not at all. But for Israel, because Iraq had not a great army, but a decent army, and they had a lot of weapons. And they were a threat to Israel. And if you'll notice, since 9/11, we've destroyed as many enemies of Israel. I don't mean enemies of the Jewish people. I mean enemies of the Zionist Israeli fascist apartheid dictatorship. We've destroyed Iraq. We've destroyed Syria. We've destroyed Libya. We've destroyed Tunisia. And all that is post 9/11. So going back to who would do this, who could wire the Twin Towers knowing that potentially thousands of innocent people would be killed? Number one, they'd have to have the skills. Number two, you'd have to be able to get them into and out of the United States. Number three, they'd have to have a strong ideological commitment to Israel über alles. And as we saw, going all the way back to the King David Hotel terrorist bombing, those Zionists didn't care who they killed, and they actually killed Israelis in that bombing. If someone was serious about doing an investigation into 9/11, you'd have to start by acknowledging that the buildings were destroyed by controlled demolition. Then you'd have to ask about the logistics of the wiring of the buildings. This is not something that can be done quickly. It cannot be done by random amateurs. And somebody had to give access to this team to go into the building before the demolition, for the demolition to take place. The next question you'd have to ask is, who would do such a thing? This is how a serious investigator would go about this. A crime's been committed, you don't know who committed it, and then you give thought as to who would have the motive, who would have the means, and who would have the opportunity. And then potentially other pieces of evidence would arise. We're now going to go deep into additional facts that shed further light on why Israelis should be considered suspects as to who actually wired the buildings.
So a new tape has just come out, and it's from 2001, but it's very interesting because it goes to Prime Minister Netanyahu's intentions. He was speaking to a group of terror victims, and he was talking about how you can get America to do what you want if you're the state of Israel, and how you can thwart the peace process. Let me give you exact quotes. Here's what he told them. He said, "I know what America is. America is a thing you can move very easily. Move it in the right direction. They won't get in their way."
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. And I think that people sitting right next door in Iran, young people, and many others will say, the time of such regimes, of such despots, is gone. There is a new age. Something new is happening.
And that is speculation on your part, or you have some evidence to that effect?
I was asked the same question in 1986. I had written a book in which I had said that the way to deal with terrorist regimes, well, with terror, was to deal with the terrorist regimes. And the way to deal with the terrorist regimes, among other things, was to apply military force against them.
The way we did in Afghanistan.
The way, for example, I want to answer your question.
I guess I'm running out of time, so I quickly was trying to get there. We've done, I think, what you proposed in Afghanistan, yet I haven't seen that sort of neighborhood effect.
Well, I think there's been an enormous effect. The effect was, we were told that there would be a contrary effect. First of all, people said that there would be tens of thousands of people streaming into Afghanistan, zealots who would be outraged by America's action, and this would produce a counter-reaction in the Arab world.
But I think you're now saying that when you take an action like we did in Afghanistan, we're going to see all the other countries just fold.
No, what we saw is something else. First of all, we saw everybody streaming out of Afghanistan. The second thing we saw is all the Arab countries and many Muslim countries trying to side with America, trying to be okay with America. The application of power is the most important thing in winning the war on terrorism. If I had to say, what are the three principles of winning the war on terror? It's like, what are the three principles of real estate, the three L's, location, location, location? The three principles of winning the war on terror are the three W's, winning, winning, and winning. The more victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier.
So those are comments by Benjamin Netanyahu, currently the Prime Minister of Israel, in March of 2024. Does it mean anything? The fact that he railroaded us or helped railroad us into Iraq? Now notice, when you watch histories of the lying that brought us into Iraq, who gets blamed? Colin Powell. Now, he deserves it because he's a scumbag. People may not know that he was also the officer that ran the cover-up campaign of the My Lai massacre. That was his other great accomplishment. But he's certainly someone that helped lie us into the Iraq War. Then, of course, there's the idiot son of George Bush Jr. But Netanyahu did a whole lot to get us into the Iraq War, and you never see that in the U.S. news media, ever. I bet if you ever saw this clip, it was a long time ago, and I bet most people watching this never saw it. So in 2008, according to the paper right there in Israel called Ma'ariv, Benjamin Netanyahu said the following at Bar Ilan University, and here's what he said. "We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." Ma'ariv quoted the former prime minister as saying he reportedly added that these events, quote, swung American public opinion in our favor. So if we're looking for an answer to the question of who benefited from 9/11, and remember, we're not talking about planes running into buildings and the buildings falling. We're talking about planes running into buildings and preset demolition charges bringing the buildings down. Clearly, guys in caves in Afghanistan with box cutters didn't do that. We don't know who did that. We don't know who did the actual wiring. I'm proposing that it could have been Israelis. Why? Because they've got the skills, they can get in and out of the United States easily, and they have the ideological commitment to commit crimes against humanity in order to, quote, save themselves. And then here we have Benjamin Netanyahu, who's obviously popular. I don't care what they tell you in Israel. He is a popular man. If he's not popular, it's because he's not killing enough people fast enough. That's the only reason why he wouldn't be popular. But he is a very popular man. He is Mr. Israel. And he's telling us that he's got the US wrapped around his finger. He's shilling us into a disastrous war. And here he is talking about 9/11. We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack of the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. And those events swung American public opinion in our favor. Previous to 9/11, Americans were pretty lukewarm about Israel. And even George Bush Jr. was a little bit on the lukewarm side. And who benefited from 9/11? Well, certainly, I don't know, the Iraqis didn't, the Afghanis didn't. Osama bin Laden didn't. I don't know who benefited, but Benjamin Netanyahu knows exactly who benefited, and it happens to be Israel. So when you see something happen and you wonder who benefits from this, well, in the opinion of the Prime Minister of Israel, Israel benefited from it. So this comes straight from their own mouths. But there's more.
How'd you feel when 9/11 happened?
9/11 happened, I felt like we should have taken the people who attacked us and brought them to justice, not invade Afghanistan, not invade Iraq. And so what we're doing now, do you believe in collective punishment? Can you answer me now? I've answered your question. Do you believe in collective punishment? Yes.
I believe that there is no army that's more moral in the world than the Israeli army that goes out of its way to protect civilian rights, much more so than any army in the world.
If it still seems extreme to some that Israel should be considered a suspect in the wiring of the World Trade Center for controlled demolition, there was plenty of investigative work that was done by federal law enforcement agencies right after 9/11, and most of it, if not all of it, has completely disappeared. The rest of this documentary is going to cover this suppressed material.
In the days after the September attacks, there were countless rumors about strange coincidences surrounding the events. One report about a group of Middle Eastern men spotted the morning of September 11th parked just across the river from New York City has not gone away. Investigation of their presence has led to questions about whether Israel was conducting espionage on U.S. soil. We're joined now by ABC's John Miller with an exclusive report this evening.
That's right, Elizabeth. This is a case that took the FBI and the CIA more than 2 months to sort out, while 5 Israelis waited in jail. It began when this woman was watching the Twin Towers burning from her apartment in New Jersey. She noticed 3 men on top of a van, posing for pictures with the towers burning in the background.
And I could see that they were like happy. You know, they didn't look shocked to me. You know, they didn't look shocked. I thought it was very strange.
The witness called police, who stopped the van hours later and arrested 5 men. All 5, it turns out, were Israeli. They were turned over to the FBI. Sources tell ABC News during a check of national security databases, some of the men were listed as having had connections with Israeli intelligence.
Well, that was an interesting report. Came and went. One thing right off the bat, very interesting. When they started the news report, they called them Middle Eastern men, right? So if people aren't paying attention or if they faded out after seeing that part of the report, they didn't learn that these were Israelis. And they weren't just Israelis, they were Israelis with intelligence connections, Israeli intelligence connections. And if that wasn't enough, they were on top of a van dancing and smiling. Now, wrap your mind around this. Those buildings collapsed. I don't know anybody who saw those buildings collapse who wasn't filled with horror, because you knew there were living human beings in there. And even if you didn't think that part of it through, the shock of seeing these enormous buildings suddenly evaporate and collapse like sand just left people kind of awestruck in a sense, because it was such an unprecedented thing. Yet these guys, unique among everyone, were standing on the top of a van, dancing and filming themselves with the destruction in the background. What kind of human beings would do that? Well, here they are on Israeli TV just a few months after being arrested. They got out of the country scot-free, by the way.
The men who were detained due to the report they were taping the first plane crash and then celebrating and joking about it actually went on television and admitted it was their job to record the attack.
And at that point, we were taken for another round of questioning, this time related to our allegedly being members of Mossad. The fact of the matter is, we are coming from a country that experiences terror daily. Our purpose was to document the event.
So let me get the logic of this straight. They come from a country that experiences terrorism daily, so they get up on a van and dance and laugh when they see people being murdered? And their purpose was to document the event, and part of that documentation required them standing on a van and dancing?
Since September 11th, more than 60 Israelis have been arrested or detained, either under the new Patriot anti-terrorism law or for immigration violations. A handful of active Israeli military were among those detained, according to investigators, who say some of the detainees also failed polygraph questions when asked about alleged surveillance activities against and in the United States. A highly placed investigator said there are, quote, tie-ins, but when asked for details, he flatly refused to describe them, saying, quote, evidence linking these Israelis to 911 is classified. I cannot tell you about evidence that has been gathered. It's classified information. Investigators suspect that the Israelis may have gathered intelligence about the attacks in advance and not shared it. Asked this week about another sprawling investigation and the detention of 60 Israelis since September 11th, the Bush administration treated the questions like hot potatoes.
I would just refer you to the Department of Justice with it. I'm not familiar with the report.
I'm aware that some Israeli citizens have been detained. With respect to why they are being detained and the other aspects of your question, whether it's because they are in intelligence services or what they were doing, I will defer to the Department of Justice and the FBI to answer that.
Beyond the 60 apprehended or detained and many deported since September 11th, another group of 140 Israeli individuals have been arrested and detained in this year in what government documents describe as, quote, an organized intelligence gathering operation designed to, quote, penetrate government facilities.
The Israeli government strongly deny.
These 5 Israelis were not involved in any intelligence operation in the United States. The story is simply false.
At this point, I believe only a very small percentage of people either heard or remembers the dancing Israeli story. But there is one story of dancing people that everybody remembers, the supposedly dancing Palestinians. We later found out that that footage was false. It had nothing to do with 9/11. It was archival footage. So in the spirit of logistics, let's think about this. In those days, there were a few big TV networks that dominated the news. Handful: ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox. There were not an infinite number. When you're watching the TV news and somebody's reading the news, they're literally reading the news. They'll read anything that they get handed. In fact, the sole qualification for being a big-time TV news broadcaster is that you can read anything from a teleprompter and say it with a straight face. The words are coming from somewhere else. The images are coming from somewhere else. And that happens to be the control room. That's what it's called. And this is what a control room looks like. And there is a news director in the control room. And he is telling the cameras which camera to look at who, at what angle, which scene we want to see, which footage we want to see. And somebody is making sure that a script is on the teleprompter so the news reader can read it. So if you think logistically, after this horrific tragedy, which killed over 3,000 people in a ghastly way occurred, some news director somewhere went into their archive, found a video of Palestinians celebrating, put it in the hands of the video engineers who ran it, and simultaneously put a script in front of the newsreader to give it context. It was a complete fraud. It was a deliberate fraud. And who was it a fraud against? It was a fraud against the Palestinians. And all these years later, we still have knuckleheads like Donald Trump and many, many others saying that they saw the Palestinians dancing and celebrating 9/11. No such thing ever occurred. But what did happen was 5 Israelis with intelligence connections were dancing and smiling and potentially celebrating. And yet that story is gone, and the false story inserted very deliberately by a dishonest news director, a corrupt news director, that story lives on. Okay, let's get back to the Israeli story, which was run in the US news media briefly right after 9/11 and then disappeared. And as of now, it's very hard to find anything about this, even on the internet.
The FBI needed the answers to 3 important questions. Who were these men? What brought them to that parking lot on the morning of September 11th? And did they have any advance knowledge of what was going to happen that day?
And there's another question I'd ask, going back to the question of logistics. We know these buildings were destroyed by controlled demolition. That means somebody had to put explosives in the buildings. The explosives had to be stored somewhere and then delivered. Where were they stored and how were they delivered?
The men said they were just taking pictures at the time. They said they worked for a company called Urban Moving. The FBI obtained a search warrant for the company's offices. Not long after the arrests, the offices of Urban Moving were simply abandoned. Almost everything was left behind.
So let's get this straight. These guys, as the buildings were burning and collapsing, alone among everybody witnessing this, were on the top of a van dancing and smiling. And just so coincidentally, they happened to have connections with Israeli intelligence. And just coincidentally, they happened to work for a trucking company, which just coincidentally happened to pull up stakes and disappear as soon as attention was paid to their existence. All right, there's one other piece that if I were an FBI super investigator, I would ask, which is, where is the closed circuit TV footage before the buildings collapsed? The day before that, the weekend. Remember earlier in the video, we had somebody talking about workmen being there with boxes, toolboxes, and cabling. And how did those men get there? How were they conveyed there? How were those boxes conveyed there? We don't have the answer, but you know what we do have? 2 facts. One, the FBI came in, swooped in, and took every bit of closed circuit TV from around the World Trade Center that day, and probably by default the days before, including the weekend. But they didn't get it all, which shows you that cameras did survive the catastrophe. So we're looking at some footage right now where you can actually see footage from 9/11. In fact, this is the moment of the impact. You can see debris falling from the sky on the pedestrians below. So there is footage of cars and people and trucks coming and going to the World Trade Center, and the FBI's got it, and they ain't showing it to you.
The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units.
Now, there's all kinds of things you can do in the military. You can drive tanks around, you can fly planes, you can repair planes and tanks, you can drive trucks, you can make food. There's just an endless number of jobs. And what did the Israelis who were detained and arrested have specialty in? Explosives. Explosives. Isn't that interesting? And note that the Israelis arrested on 9/11, some of them were also experts in electronic surveillance intercept. This is a dimension of 9/11 that's almost never been discussed by anybody. We're going to go into it in great detail, and we're going to show how it's connected to many, many other things.
The majority of those questioned, quote, stated they served in military intelligence, electronic surveillance intercept, and/or explosive ordnance units.
And what do we know about people who serve in the Israeli military? We're told they're the most moral army on earth, the most moral army that ever was. Is that so?